So our session this week is about social construction. Social construction is one of the theories of the policy process that we have discussed that contributes to our ability to do better policy analysis by understanding some of the intricacies of the inputs, if you will, to what happens in the policy process. So social construction by Ingram and Schneider's model, which originally came about or was proposed in 1993, talks about how, depending on how you are socially constructed or a particular group or stakeholder is socially constructed, they're likely to see benefits or burdens as a result of policy. So I apply this frame when looking at reproductive policy and the social construction of motherhood, and that'll be the case study that we use as an example here. But I'm going to start with sort of a more everyday idea, also on the gender front, that an example of what a social construction might be. So this idea has long sort of rankled me, that the common joke or trope about women aren't good drivers. And one of the reasons I object to this particular form of humor is I think that it perpetuates negative stereotypes in such a way that could actually have consequential or tangible consequences in policy. If we think of a group in a particular way, we are likely to react to them in a particular way. And so if we think that women are bad drivers, even if that's just sort of a humorous aside to some, it's likely to influence how we act towards women, and more importantly, how we act towards women potentially in policy. And this is just one example of many, as you can imagine. But the images you're seeing here are, if you Google the phrase women drivers, the images that come, these are the first sort of images that come up. And sometimes it's interesting to me to see what a Google search yields, because it comes up with, you'll see all these sort of supposedly humorous disaster scenarios about how women are clueless and can't drive. And if we investigate the veracity of that, if you will, one of the things we do when we look at policy or many other areas of inquiry, right, we look for data and facts that support suppositions. And what we find actually when we look at the data is that women actually have fewer accidents that result in death than do male drivers. And the reason to bring this up is that it's just interesting to see that what we believe, what we think we know, isn't always substantiated by facts. And we talk a lot in policy about how if we're going to make judgments about something, that we want to know based on what outcomes. And I've mentioned to you before, I think, that the outcomes of interest for health policy specifically are, or health-related policy, right, tend to be morbidity and mortality. So that's sort of suffering and death. Those are important indicators, right? And so if we think of morbidity as being brought, or mortality as being brought about by accidents, and then we look at sort of how those accidents play out, we see that women are actually in fewer crashes that result in death, or crashes that result in injury or property damage for that matter. And interestingly, insurance companies in the private sector are aware of this, because insurance companies calculate risk and they determine premiums of people based on that risk. And what they find is that since, and in this case, it's a benefit to women because their premiums tend to be lower. If you have teenage children, as I had not that long ago, or you were a teenager, you may remember your parents sort of tearing their hair out about the cost, right? Well, we know that teenagers and people over around 80, I think, are the most likely to have car accidents, and the insurance that they have to pay reflects that data. So the statistics show that as a group, women are less likely to get in a car accident, commit moving violations, and also buy cars that are more costly to insure. And they also drive fewer miles than men. So interesting, but so let's just proceed with this as an example. And how policy can sometimes influence a question of interest for me is the individual autonomy of people, right? And so ideas about women's competencies or incompetencies may influence policy. In this case, we see, and there are lots of other influential factors into why Saudi Arabia established a law or forbade women to drive. But a couple of years ago, Saudi Arabia agreed to let women drive. But I just think it's interesting. That's kind of the extreme of that really wasn't based on the idea, I think, that maybe women couldn't drive so much as that they ought not drive because of their appropriate roles based on culture and religion in the family and in the home and in the domestic sphere. Although I think there's also some social constructions or stereotypes that suggest that women aren't really good with technology or technically competent or can't operate a motor vehicle, if you will. So we see in Saudi Arabia, even though this law changed a couple of years ago, it still hasn't resulted in complete freedoms, and a women's driving activist is still on trial 2 years after the ban was lifted. I just found this relatively recent article attesting to that. So once something is in policy, I only mention this because policies not only are influenced by our stereotypical prejudices or ideas, but they also perpetuate those ideas, right? So and they tend to last. So while some policy is quite inconsequential, policy lays down a marker, if you will, that establishes some things in culture and society that can influence people's ability to move about freely or conduct their lives. So in this case, we're going to be talking about reproductive technologies, defining social construction, considering evolving roles of women, and the implication for women policy and democracy if we sort of make policy based on social constructions, and in what ways those play out. So this is a line drawing or charcoal drawing by Marie Cassatt, who is probably, if not the most, one of the most consequential women artists. And I just think that this is kind of the quintessential idea of what motherhood looks like. When I did my Google search this time to look at motherhood, or I think motherhood was the key word, these were the images that appeared. So in what I see about these is that they're very traditional, they are very white, they're kind of, maybe heteronormative. I don't know if we can discern that from this, but what it suggests is that when people think about motherhood, these are some of the images that come to their minds or come to their Google search when they search for it. And if you think about, maybe an easier example is thinking, as we may have talked about before, what does a professor look like? What does a business person look like? If you close your eyes and conjure that image, then you may think of, when I think of a professor, even still, I think about the older guy in a fuzzy sweater kind of thing. And that is benign and fine, I suppose, except that when we start to see people as being the normative professor as being male, that can be problematic, because then if we see someone who's not the old white guy in a fuzzy sweater in a professor role, we might treat them differently, or they might not get to the job because we might be thinking that it doesn't really seem to fit for us that they belong there. So these are some of the ideas that social construction grapples with. Technology is something else that pushes the limits of and creates the need for policy, if you will. So, where reproductive policy is concerned, one of the earliest instances of reproductive technology, if you will, was simple artificial insemination. And there was an example in the early 20th century when artificial insemination was first practiced. It didn't meet the ethical standards that we have in medical practice now, that when confronted with an infertile couple, a doctor sort of independently decided that he would inseminate a woman with a medical student's sperm because the husband was infertile, and he didn't want to burden the couple with that information. So that was done. The patient was never informed. And, when you think about it, the privacy concerns and all the issues that in the 21st century, or even the later 20th century, this would have been an inconceivable, no pun intended, an inconceivable turn of events. But when things like that start to happen, it raises ethical flags or it raises other issues. That's when things come to our attention about which we ask the question, does this warrant policy intervention? So we've talked about important reasons for policy interventions as being externalities or information asymmetries, and I think those are often at play. And certainly if we're doing clandestine artificial insemination, not informing the interested parties, that's an information asymmetry, right? That parents don't know who their biological children are. Children don't know the health history of they don't know their true health history if they don't know who their biological parents are. So 23andMe and modern technology has sort of obviated that concern, but I'm just suggesting that about 100 years ago is when we started to see some of these reproductive options come into being, and then we're confronted as a society, how do we deal with those ethically and how do we deal with them through policy? So another advancement or technological advancement that allowed previously infertile individuals to have their own biological children was the so-called test tube baby. I don't know, this is in the early days of in vitro fertilization. There were two doctors named Steptoe and Edwards. It always sounds like a vaudeville act to me. But these doctors decided that they could assist people through reproductive technology by fertilizing an egg outside of the womb and then implanting that embryo within the womb in order to help a previously infertile person reproduce. So that would address issues with people who had, for instance, blocked fallopian tubes or various other, I won't go into the obstetrical parts of this, but just to say helped address infertility. But of course, it was very scary at the time. A lot of people didn't know, what would be the externalities, what would be the influence of that procedure on the health and well-being of mothers and babies long term. So it was sort of like a real-time experiment. That was in 1978. In 1982, I guess, the first so-called test tube baby was born in the United States. And now with this track record, of course, it's very likely that many, if not most of you, know somebody who has availed themselves of in vitro fertilization. Many people have grown their families through this means. And it's been an ongoing dispute as to how much that should be regulated or how much policy influence there should be in that realm. And for the most part, it's been avoided, I guess I would say. The American Society for Reproductive Medicine has mostly maintained purview over in vitro fertilization, making the claim, which is often made that doctor knows best, right? And that doctors will only do things that are recommended by their appropriate medical societies, such as the American Society for Reproductive Medicine, and therefore they don't need to have intrusive regulation. So, and doctors being a privileged group, a positively socially constructed group, right? For the most part, people think highly of the medical profession. We've seen Pew surveys that substantiate that. So, but they're seeking to have less burdensome regulation imposed on them and constraining their ability to act autonomously as physicians and make medical recommendations based on their own expertise and beliefs. So that's the dance that we see, right? So the imposition of regulations ostensibly for the well-being and health of some party, citizens, some stakeholders, and the autonomy of either those citizens or others to act in the public sphere. Another technological advance that has influenced motherhood, if you will, is egg donation. So people can become a mother by just donating an egg. I mean, we might not think of that person as a mother because they've only donated some genetic material, or we might think of them as being a mother. I mean, that's even an open question. But this is just an example of an ad. Again, if you look at the image and who it represents and who it doesn't represent, I think that's an interesting insight into how social construction comes about. Who do we think of as being the best egg donors, if you will? Where do we put those ads? Where do we see those ads? So anyway, but the technological advance of egg donation, of in vitro fertilization, which sometimes does require so-called donor eggs, or eggs for which it's called a donation, but people are actually paid quite a bit of money, that has also become an issue in policy. So the idea of social construction, the social construction theoretical frame, raises to a conscious level the idea that social order is not necessarily a part of the nature of things. It exists as a product of human activity. So ideas and beliefs might be have some fundamental basis in biological fact, but how society is constructed is the product of human activity, and that's the assertion that the social construction frame makes. This theoretical frame requires that we take a critical stance toward taken for granted knowledge and consider the cultural and historical context of the categories and concepts that shape our understanding of the world. So that's what we're trying to do in order to better understand what influences policy preferences and outcomes, and this critical stance taken towards for granted knowledge. So when we take something for granted, it means we accept it as being true without really thinking about it too much. Now, since if you're a lot younger than me, you might think like the idea of women being bad drivers. I don't know if that's considered passé or not, but at least for a long period of time, and I think some of those ideas persist, it was taken for granted that that was just sort of true. And there are implications to such stereotypes. So Ingram and Schneider are political scientists, and they applied, the social construction theory had been used in sociology and other fields. Ingram and Schneider brought it into the field of public policy, and they looked at the degree to which those who are positively socially constructed and powerful would receive benefits through policy, and those who are negatively socially constructed and weak would be burdened by policy more or less. So they define the advantaged as groups who are positively portrayed and powerful. Contenders are those who are negatively portrayed but still powerful. Dependents are defined as those who are positively portrayed but powerless, and deviants are negatively portrayed and powerless. So they came up with these 4 quadrants that talk about these different constructions that are likely to influence policy. And then they show how those constructions influence policy by defining the benefits and burdens that are ascribed to groups along the lines of their thinking. So in one of their earlier articles, their 1993 article, this is kind of a primitive looking graphic by modern standards, but still it lays out these ideas of what types of groups at that time were considered to be part of these different categories: the advantaged, contenders, dependents, and deviants. And you see that those who were considered positively socially constructed and powerful included business people, veterans, scientists. It says the elderly. I don't know, that we could probably have an argument or a discussion about whether or not that's still true. But so the classically advantaged groups who would receive benefits through policy included these groups. Deviants were considered criminals, drug addicts, communists, flag burners, gangs. Those are the examples that they used. And of course, this is where the sort of alarm bell went off for me, or what raised my interest in this frame, which I find very powerful, was how they characterized mothers, right? They characterized them as positively socially constructed, but weak. And okay, so that's perhaps historically true, but wait till we get to the definition a couple of slides down, which I think you've already read. But anyway, I objected in principle to this idea, or at least it raised my hackles some. I think the only group I didn't mention was those who are strong, politically powerful, that is, but are negatively constructed. So these may include cultural elites, the rich. I don't know if the rich are negatively constructed anymore, but one thing we see is that those categories can change over time, which we'll talk about in a minute. Anyway, this further graphic from the 1993 article shows that, and it's kind of hard to read. I don't know what a better way would be to array this information, except to say that the two most important quadrants from our point of view are the advantaged and the deviant, because what we see happening in those ways is that the advantaged are likely to be benefited by policy, and deviants are likely to be burdened by policy. And on the part of policymakers like to loudly tout when they are conferring benefits on the advantaged. You know, we've done this policy, we've implemented this policy for veterans or for some highly regarded group, because then that sort of glory or positive construction reflects back on them. So that you'll find that when policymakers are advantaging powerful groups who are positively socially constructed, they're quite likely to talk loudly about it. Similarly, they're quite likely to talk loudly about heaping burdens upon deviant groups. Deviant meaning just those who are not well regarded and also may have little political power. So politicians will talk loudly about how they've imposed this burden on this negative group, because that reflects well on them, the policymaker, as well, because it looks like they're doing something good about something bad in society, if you will. What we find on the other axis is that when policymakers tend not to like to talk about the benefits they confer on contenders who have a negative social construction. And as far as dependents are concerned, it's kind of variable. It depends on if it suits the policymaker at that time. So you don't always get a lot of press about benefits or burdens conferred on dependents. Here's the quote that I was alluding to before. And Ingram and Schneider are both female political scientists. But this sentence caught my attention, that they characterized mothers as dependents along with widows, orphans, the mentally handicapped, families in poverty, the homeless, most students, and many other categories of unfortunates. So thinking about mothers as a category of unfortunates didn't sit well with me, but I understood, I guess I understood to a degree what they were thinking, and let's investigate that through the idea of what is motherhood anyway. So this gets to our need in the policy analysis process to define the central terms that we're using. So it would seem that motherhood is not a word that we have to define, but in recent years, when one could become a mother through multiple means, or in many different ways could act as mother, say, in many different ways than we had previously imagined, such as through egg donation, for instance. So you might donate an egg and then never know what happened, if a child was born of that donation or not. You might donate an egg to your sister, and be involved in that child's life. So there's all kinds of different ways that motherhood or parenthood can come about in the increasingly technological age. Not only, and so this first image that you see is a pipette with the embryo for the in vitro fertilization process. And of course, these are birth control pills. So we're talking about not just the ability to become a parent or a mother in this case, but also the ability to refrain from becoming a parent or a mother, if one so chooses. We see in a later version of Ingram, please don't eat that paper, and my cat's not really helping that much. 2007, Ingram and Schneider were joined by a third author, and they advanced their thinking on the theoretical frame of social construction. And I think it's interesting to this very simple change in their graphic here. It's still a relatively primitive graphic by modern standards, but what it shows is that categories can change, right? So those in different categories can move around based on evolving public beliefs. And those evolving public beliefs are caused by lots of factors and result in policy, but policy may also cause the beliefs. So if, for instance, we see that restrictions are made on certain groups, then, such as, for instance, the idea that's been popular in a number of states in recent years to drug test welfare recipients, for instance. So this idea that welfare recipients should be drug tested implies that welfare recipients have a higher propensity to be drug using than the general population, perhaps, or that drug using is a disqualification or should be a disqualification for the receipt of public services, which may be a value that we want to espouse in the case of the latter. But in the former, the idea, just like the idea that, women are bad drivers, so to speak, is not borne out by the data. And we see that the idea that welfare recipients are more likely to be drug using is also not borne out by the data, or welfare recipients or people of lower income. People of higher income also are a heavily substance using group, but because of their powerful constructions, their particular forms of drug using usually aren't proscribed by law. And they have more autonomy based on the power that they have. So the next two slides have to do with the economic and political power of women. And the reason that I bring that up is because these are, if we think about mothers, mothers are women, generally speaking, right? And that there's a disparity in status between men and women on many fronts. So if we think about how powerful are women as a group based on some solid metrics such as economic and political power, what we find, even though this data is pretty old, but it is still borne out in what we're currently observing, that men, as a proportion of the population, men are more highly represented in positions of power. So you see total labor force participation, male versus female. That, let's see, what does it say? Total labor force, the percentage of the total labor force that is female is lower than that of which is male. The percentage of U.S. women in the labor force, the percentage of women in civilian workforce who are college educated is quite low, actually, surprisingly. And the weekly earnings of women is lower than that of men. What we see by looking at these bar charts, we're looking at a comparison between, at first I was thinking it was the male-female comparison, but it's a comparison between 1970 and 2010. And so what we can say is we're moving in the right direction. I always talk about considering magnitude and trend. So in some ways that gap is closing somewhat, but there are still deficiencies with regard to earnings and representation in the workforce, especially with regard to quality of positions. So if we think about political power as, I think my helper has to go down. If we think about political power, how would we measure that? Well, how many state legislators or representatives in the U.S. Congress or executive level appointees are female? And we see that even though progress has been made since the late 70s, that we still have less than a quarter of state legislators who are women. So 75% of state legislators are men. We still have only about a quarter or a fifth of the members of Congress who are female, meaning, somewhere near 75 or 80% of representatives are male. And so does that have a question that has been investigated and is investigated continuously as well? Does that make any difference in outcomes for women? I would submit that it does, and that's not really our discussion that we're having here, but there is lots of literature that investigates that question. What are the differences? But I would say it's not only about outcomes where that's concerned, but to me, equity as a criterion is important. An equitable representation of citizens in a democracy, it seems to me, is preferable, or proportional representation of citizens within a democracy. But that could be a whole other class discussion on its own. But what we can observe here is that women have less political and economic power than men, and that was kind of the main point of these slides. So if you look at this, in May 2017, the House Republicans celebrated the passage of the American Health Care Act. The American Health Care Act was actually had a lot of facets to it that were considered to be disadvantageous to women, according to sources such as the National Women's Law Center. And a lot was made at the time of this picture. So a picture's worth 1,000 words. This picture was widely distributed and commented upon in that it's all men, really. There is one woman over there in the right side that I can see, but it shows that the act was championed primarily by men, is being celebrated mostly by men, and some, although this also is it's not just a male-female, but there was a liberal conservative, of course, breakdown of opinions regarding the tangible aspects of the act that were considered to benefit or burden women. And to the degree that there were considered burdens, I think I have a slide that I do. Okay, so here's another picture, a table of deliberation over the American Health Care Act, and it was proposed and deliberated over primarily by men only. The National Women's Law Center specifically talked about, if we're going to say there's a benefit or burden, we have to point to specifically what that benefit or burden was. So based on the status quo, that this Health Care Act, which would have repealed the ACA, would take away maternity coverage and would take away or prevent health care such as birth control, cancer screenings, STI testing, and Planned Parenthood. So Planned Parenthood is often a politically volatile topic, but some of what happens at Planned Parenthood is not in the abortion debate. So preventive health care, cancer screenings, all of that stuff. There are some things in there upon which more people would agree more broadly, but I think the main point here is that these are the specific policies. So if you're ever going to say that this is beneficial or burdensome, you have to say what are the attributes according to whom that are the tangible benefits and burdens to which you're referring. With regard to the representativeness of women in the public sphere, Diana Becton, who's pictured here, who was the president of the American Judicial Association, 95% of elected prosecutors are men and 75% are white. So she's also the first African American to serve as district attorney in Contra Costa County in California. And I was really pleased to be able to have her on a panel that we held a couple of years ago at the Schar School, and she speaks with great presence and authority, and in her view, it is influential if women aren't at the table or on the bench, so to speak. And if 75% are white and 95% are men, it is possible to imagine that the interests of non-white citizens or non-male citizens might not be fully represented. So social constructions can, as we noted with that one graphic that shows, without the lines in the middle, that shows things moving around, that they can change over time, and they are influenced by social movements, technological change, and judicial decisions. So these are some of the specific things. And again, it's always good to talk in policy analysis with as much specificity as you can. So social movements such as the women's liberation movement of the 60s and 70s changed ideas about how women can and should behave in society. Technological change can bring about changes in those social constructions as well. And if you think about the idea of motherhood and how it's socially constructed, has changed and been influenced by birth control pills and in vitro fertilization and other technological advances that bring about public benefits, but also bring about sort of cultural strain. And then finally, some judicial decisions also influence and are influenced by social constructions. So a few Supreme Court cases that specifically had influence in the reproductive realm are these, right? So the idea that the first one is Griswold v. Connecticut, which established that married couples had the right to buy contraception. Some states forbade that from happening, and that's interesting when you think about it. Can you imagine being like an adult married individual who for whom birth control was illegal? So that Supreme Court case overturned that state restriction and said, no, that's not okay. So we all know the Roe v. Wade decision, of course, that said that abortion was a right that should be afforded women, that they should have access to abortion without undue burden. Planned Parenthood v. Casey was a case in which the Supreme Court made the decision that states could, however, impose certain restrictions that varied over different states on access to abortion. So even though the right was established by Roe v. Wade in 73, in 92 the Supreme Court ruled that states could restrict that right without undue burden. And I think that this statement from an earlier case, which says each individual has a right to be free from unwarranted governmental intrusion into matters so fundamentally affecting a person as the decision of whether to bear or beget a child. So that idea as that being a fundamental to a right of privacy or autonomy by law in the United States is an important value that's expressed in that statement. So this idea about women's representativeness, I just threw in this chart from the American Values Survey, which asked people whether or not they thought the country would be better off if we had more women in political office, just to kind of see what people think of that. You know, do people think it makes a difference, that it's a matter of equity and it's desirable, or do they see it as not something of value? And so we see that among all Americans, the majority at 58% did agree that they felt the country would be better off if we had more women in political office. And we see that there are gender differences in those beliefs as well, that more women are likely to believe that or to agree with that statement than are men, as you can see by the chart. So this is my own version of Ingram and Schneider's social construction framework, specifically arraying the different ways in which women are mothers and the ways in which policy plays out depending on the construction, depending on where you fit into the quadrants that we see. So I made the argument in the article that advantaged groups who are positively socially constructed and politically or economically strong include traditional nuclear families. And we see that, in fact, what is the benefit to those groups? In order to confer a benefit on that group, tax benefits are given to married couples with dependent children. So that's a form of benefit. So that's a policy benefit. And traditional nuclear families have been, for much of our history, and certainly perhaps persisting till today, but certainly through much of the 20th century, advantaged and positively socially constructed. This contender group, I would say, I characterize as the people who use contraception, contraceptors, right? So I didn't make up that word. It was used by the Centers for Disease Control. So I thought, okay, if they say it, then I can say it. So contraceptors, so people that use contraception are people who are exercising their right to not become parents. And we see that this is somewhat contentious. One could argue that the normative female role is ideally involving some status as mother, at least in some form over the course of a lifetime. And the benefit of birth control access, right, is not as freely given as, or not as widely touted as tax benefits for traditional families, so to speak. So there are mandates for that infertility treatment, for instance, must be covered in 15 states. It might be more now or less. I haven't looked at it lately. But the idea is that the infertile, unfortunately, have a somewhat negative or stigmatized social construction. And that when policymakers made these laws that provided for infertility treatment. They did not widely tout this policy, and the benefit was conferred, but it's constrained in ways that we'll talk about in a moment. Dependents are defined as those who are positively socially constructed but politically weak. And we see that a benefit that is given to this group would be WIC, the Women, Infants, and Children Nutritional Benefit, which positively depicts mothers and mothers of young children or pregnant mothers and offers them this benefit. So that's an example of a policy there. That WIC has been around for a long time, and generally people think well of it. In the deviant category, those who seek or have abortions, or those who seek to reproductively clone, which we've talked about that. It's not a real big issue right now. But certainly abortion, one could argue that those who seek abortion are renouncing the motherly role, are perceived as being negatively socially constructed through policy and in the public mind oftentimes, and can be weak politically. So when I say weak politically, how do we measure that? So we're going to talk about the restrictions and bans that are placed on abortion, even in the most recently in the coronavirus situation, where access to abortion, there was an attempt to close down access to abortion by saying that it was a non-essential medical procedure that should be avoided at this time. So that's a controversial position that we won't go into at this time, but just to show one example of the very many ways in which restrictions are sought on the procedure, the degree to which those who have the procedure can be stigmatized and usually try to keep private that decision as best they are able. This may be changing somewhat. I see changes in this regard in popular culture these days, in movies or in TV shows or in the press, where people talk freely about their experience with access to abortion, but I would say that the persisting sentiment is still one that is relatively negative. So this infertility treatment insurance coverage, which affects this contender group, as we saw, has lots of restrictions on it. Even though it's a benefit, it has some restrictions that underscore the importance of traditional views of motherhood. So for instance, in a couple of places where the infertility treatment coverage was put into place, it is expressly indicated that it can only be given to married couples. And in the case of Texas, Maryland, Connecticut, and California, they've said that there can be religious exemptions for providers. And in another instance or two, IVF coverage was excluded from the state laws requiring infertility treatments. And of course, in vitro fertilization is quite expensive, somewhere around $20,000 or to $25,000 per cycle, which only has a 1 in 4 chance of producing the expected happy result of a baby at the end of that. So it is quite pricey, and that is a reason to constrain access. But in the proffering of this benefit, there are also constraints placed. And the social construction theory helps us understand the degree to which positive or negative social constructions are at play in the decision to impose burdens or advance benefits. So burdens are defined as rules that confer disadvantages, tools that constrict control or liberty, or other actions that confer negative values on a group. So I really do like and think it's important to use foundational definitions when doing your analysis so that you can establish a clear marker for what you mean. And Ingram and Schneider provided us with this definition of what they mean when they say burden. And I think that's really important because confer disadvantages, or here's the most important phrase I think for me, well, they're all important in this definition, but they're tools. Policy is a mechanism or a tool that constricts or controls liberty. So in order to measure that or demonstrate the degree to which that's possible, the Guttmacher Institute, which is a reproductive rights entity, think tank, tracks all the different laws that seek to constrain access to abortion. And whether you think this is a negative or a positive is really beside the point here. We're looking at it from the perspective of, is it a benefit or a burden to individual citizens? So what they did is identified, I think it's 6 or 7 different categories of types of restrictions. And then by state, they look at the number of such restrictions. And some of those restrictions include requiring a waiting period, requiring that doctors read a verbal description of the procedure, describing, providing a written or verbal description of fetal development to the person accessing abortion. There's other requirement for ultrasound, requirement for parents to be involved in the case of minors. So all these things, again, whether you think of it as a positive or negative, they are constraining mechanisms. And we also see, if we think about magnitude and trend of abortion restrictions, that during this one short period, again, this slide is a little bit older, but it does show when we saw a steep rise in the number of restrictions enacted. And we can also begin to see a trend, which is a trend of the magnitude increasing, and the trend, going upward. And I think that continues through 2020. So I, through this analysis, found evidence to support this supposition that I had, that policy tended to benefit those who favored taking on traditional maternal roles, and that burdens were imposed on those outside of traditional maternal roles. So those who eschewed or refused or sought to avoid motherhood were more likely to be in the deviant or contender category and not see benefits in policy. And those who sought to embrace traditional motherhood were more likely to receive policy benefits. This is another image from the WIC page, which again shows, this is kind of a quintessential image of what motherhood looks like. If you think back to our Google search that we looked at earlier, it excludes other people who are non-white, but it exudes this idea of a traditional early 20th century idea about who is deserving of benefits in the public mind. A number of years back, Rush Limbaugh took Sandra Fluke to task over when she was fighting for having birth control covered He talked about how this should not be something that American taxpayers should have to absorb the costs of her sexual activity, even though she asserted that she needed birth control for reasons other than, for a health condition and not for contraception, actually. It should be beside the point. In either case, it's about who has the right to decide, who can exert more power or influence over the procedure, and whether or not individuals have access to that which they would like to access for their own definition of their own health and well-being. So there's another kind of happy traditional family. There's just some colorful condoms, I guess. We have some color at the end. So anyway, this access to the goods of life, to fulfilling one's capacity for human flourishing through choosing parenthood or not choosing parenthood, can be influenced through policy by, in part, influenced by social constructions we have about who receives benefits and burdens through policy. So I think in every case, I think particularly with social policies, social construction, not surprisingly, can help advance our understanding, but it also can have utility in advancing your understanding in lots of different policy realms. So I look forward to our discussion on the discussion board, to hearing your insights about this topic.